Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Eichenfield, and it's a pleasure for me to be part of the 11th Annual Symposium for the American Acne and Rosacea Society, and thank you for being here. So today I will be talking about the positive correlation of hidradenitis suppurativa and ultra-processed foods consumption, and I specifically chose that picture to capture your attention since it's the foods that we all love. For those of you who are not familiar with hidradenitis suppurativa, it's a chronic inflammatory skin condition, also known as acne inversa. So HS, or hidradenitis suppurativa, usually affects the intertriginous skin areas, such as the axilla, the groin, the perianal, perineal, and the inframammary regions, as you can see in this graph. HS usually causes a profound psychosocial impact due to the pain and disfigurement that it causes. So the clinical manifestations can usually range from very mild to very severe manifestations, and we usually use the Hurley staging system, going from Hurley stage 1 to Hurley stage 3. So the clinical manifestations can usually range from skin nodules to skin abscesses, sinus tracts, and scar tissue formation. And this is actually a picture of one of our patients in our HS clinics after, of course, obtaining her consent. HS usually affects around 1 to 4% of the population. The symptoms usually appear after puberty with a usual onset in the second or third decade of life. It usually affects females more than males, and African Americans may be disproportionately highly affected. So from what we already know, HS is a follicular occlusive disease involving the follicular portion of the folliculopilosebaceous unit. However, the pathogenesis is not fully understood, but several factors have been associated with HS, including genetics, mechanical stress, diet, smoking, hormones, and obesity. We are specifically interested in the relationship between obesity, diet, and HS. And so, what is the relationship between diet and HS? And what specific dietary factors or components contribute to or worsen HS symptoms? In order to answer that question, we looked at data on the racial differences in obesity, dietary consumptions, and HS prevalence. And this first graph represents the race-specific prevalence of HS. And as you can see, African Americans have the highest prevalence rates of HS, as opposed to Hispanics who have the lowest prevalence rates of HS. Now, the second graph here represents the age-adjusted prevalence of obesity among adults. And as you can see, African Americans or non-Hispanic Blacks have the highest prevalence rates of obesity, and Hispanics have the second highest rates of obesity. So based on these two graphs, we now know that non-Hispanic Blacks or African Americans have the highest prevalence rates of HS and the highest obesity rates, in contrast to Hispanics, who have the lowest prevalence rates of HS despite having the second highest rates of obesity in the US. And so is it really a matter of obesity? Because if it is, then why don't Hispanics have the second highest rates of HS? So in order to answer that complicated question, we also looked at dietary differences between those two major groups. And we found that Hispanics have the lowest consumption rates of ultra-processed foods as opposed to non-Hispanic Blacks, who actually have the highest rates of consumption of ultra-processed foods. As for minimally processed foods, we found that Hispanics have the highest consumption rates of minimally processed foods as opposed to non-Hispanic Blacks. And so based on this data, we think that ultra-processed foods correlate with hidradenitis suppurativa, and minimally processed foods can actually protect you from hidradenitis suppurativa. And what is the role of obesity in all of that? Is it a matter of quality more than the quantity that a person is of calories that a person is consuming? According to the NOVA food classifications, there are 4 major group types. We have unprocessed or minimally processed foods that are foods which did not undergo processing or underwent minimal processing techniques such as fractioning, grinding, or pasteurization. And these are foods like fresh fruits and vegetables, nuts, and eggs. We also have processed culinary ingredients that are obtained from minimally processed foods and used to season, cook, and create culinary dishes. And these are foods like salt, sugar, and vegetable oil. We have processed foods that are unprocessed or minimally processed foods or culinary dishes which have been added processed culinary ingredients that are foods like meat and salt solution, fruits in syrup or candied, and bread. And finally, we have ultra-processed foods that are food products derived from foods or parts of foods, being added cosmetic food additives not used in culinary ingredients. And these are, again, the foods that we all love, like hamburgers, nuggets, and sodas. To identify correlations, we cross-referenced 3 sources. We first looked at the relative search volume data for Google searches for hidradenitis suppurativa between January 2004 and August 2023, and we did the same thing for melanoma that was used as a control. We also looked at published data on the prevalence of HS and ultra-processed foods consumption by nation, state, race, and age. And finally, we looked at the variation of diet patterns from a US National Health and Nutrition Examination survey-based paper. So we first looked at the heterogeneity of Google search for hidradenitis suppurativa among states in the US. And here are 2 chloropleth maps showing the heterogeneity of Google search for HS on the right and melanoma on the left. And as you can see, the relative search volume distribution for HS is much more heterogeneous than it is for melanoma. And this is statistically significant, with standard deviations of 13.07 for HS versus 9.82 for melanoma. We then did a correlation analysis to assess the relationship between processed and ultra-processed foods consumption with Google searches for HS by country, state, racial, and age groups in the US. This first graph here represents the correlation of the relative search volume for HS and the ultra-processed foods consumption by country, where each dot represents a different country. And as you can see, there's a strong positive correlation between the relative search volume for HS and the consumption of ultra-processed foods, as opposed to melanoma, where you can note a more sparse distribution. Similar results were noted for the correlation of the relative search volume for HS and processed foods consumption by states in the US, where the states that have the highest consumption rates of processed foods also have the highest rates of relative search volume for HS. Now, this third graph represents the correlation of the prevalence of HS and the consumption of ultra-processed foods by racial groups. And as you can see, non-Hispanic Blacks have the highest consumption rates of ultra-processed foods and the highest prevalence rates of HS. And finally, we found that the 20 to 39-year-old age group has the highest consumption rates of ultra-processed foods and the highest prevalence rates for HS. We then did a linear regression analysis to assess trends in Google searches for HS over the years in the US. And as you can see, there has been a significant increase in that, as opposed to melanoma, which has relatively been stable. We then performed a correlation analysis to assess the relationship between these trends and the consumption of ultra-processed foods. And as you can see in this graph, the consumption of ultra-processed foods has increased among the years in the US, which positively and strongly correlates with the increase in the relative search volume for HS in the US during that same time period. As for minimally processed foods, we found a negative and strong correlation between the decrease in minimally processed foods consumption and the increase in the relative search volume for HS in the US during the same time period. So based on all of our results, we believe that there is an association between ultra-processed foods consumption and hidradenitis suppurativa. We are aware that studies are needed to address whether limiting ultra-processed foods consumption might ameliorate HS, incorporating BMI data to better isolate the effects of dietary patterns from those of obesity. And this is our golden rule that we tell everyone in our clinics, not only HS patients. Always prefer natural or minimally processed foods and freshly made dishes and meals to ultra-processed foods. I would like to thank my amazing PI and mentor, Dr. Luis Garza, as well as my colleagues, Bita Badie, who's a medical student and currently a research fellow in our lab, and Caitlin Williams, who recently obtained her PhD and is an MD candidate at Johns Hopkins. I would also like to add that this work was also funded by the National Institutes of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases. And here are my references. Thank you.